Okay, so welcome John Wilmott, the Woodland Bard, with the Nature Folklore and Echo YouTube channel, podcast, and Substack blog, and author and advocate of living in a harmonious manner with nature, with a tree labyrinth close to the Shees Caves in Kesh Corrigan, County Leitrim. Although you spent most of your time around Glastonbury, England, another location where the veil is thin and the connection with the land spirits is strong. Thank you for joining us. Is there anything you'd like to add in your introduction to us, John?
Well, that was very complimentary. Thanks very much, Josie, and thanks very much for inviting me to have a chat. I suppose a couple of things. The Glastonbury thing is a vague memory. I was there for 4 years, 69 to 72. Really, most of my life has been on the Inner Hebrides, mainly the Isle of Mull. I had 12 years in the USA, but Ireland now for, I don't know, 25 years? It's coming up that way anyway. But I suppose, funnily enough, a lot of people tell me that the little time I had in Glastonbury, the 4 years, that's where I picked up my accent, they reckon. So totally lost anything Hebridean. But you listen to my children, and they've certainly kept the accent anyway. So anyway, thank you. And anything you'd like to ask me, this is going to be a lovely, interesting conversation. I can feel it.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you. Okay, so I was looking at Schumann's book, The Fairy Way, and it's very comprehensive. It looks at sort of it looks at sort of meditations to go into with the she, and it seems to be the most balanced for me. Looking at sort of as a practical way of working with the she on a spiritual level using meditation. Have you come across it, and what do you think about the book?
I'm not. The thing is with me, I'm not very much a book reader, but certainly amongst storytellers and people of interest in whether it's the she, the fae, fairy world, whatever they're into, the name of human comes up. They make or min, whatever it is, they make references to that. And from what I gather, the basis of that is definitely what I was brought up with. Definitely what I was brought up with through my family. More so with my uncles, aunt Lillian, and great uncles as well, and a great aunt and Aunt Rose. And I gather he talks about very much that you open yourself to the space. You've actually got to connect to that space, and I gather he gives techniques for this, which is, I suppose, today we might call that mindfulness. A kind of attraction like shamanism. I don't know as far as the words go, but that's definitely the way. You've got to be in that knowing of that conditioning to actually make that connection. And then what you interpret for that, it changes from person to person. So that's all I understand about human at the moment anyway.
That's right. Yeah. And also following on from that, John, I mean, a lot of us would deal with looking after our sort of our own spiritual health, and in terms of cleansing ourselves and so forth. And is there any particular sort of way of working? Sometimes, if you can maybe sort of you can trod in something, you can walk into area maybe and maybe just catch something that you don't need to. And is there a way to protect yourself maybe with encountering maybe sort of like the darker aspect of the she, sort of like the banshee or so forth, and to cleanse any attachments like that off of us?
Well, as I had mentioned in messages and discussions before, I sort of tend to reverse interpret what a lot of people who involve themselves in their belief of the she, the fae world, the fairies. And I think the starting point of this is a lot of people, they're reacting to perhaps their past church experiences, their Sunday school, their family, Christian church associations, even Muslim church associations. The one thing that seems to be common in religion and even in school education, I think, is to inspire, is kind of branding fear into people, even starting with the idea of heaven and earth. those two concepts put fear into human minds. So what happens is people have this sort of experience, I think, of fear and discomfort. And I think humans are very much in a state of wanting to blame something exterior to something that's going on with themselves. So the way I kind of interpret that, if you go into a room and you feel uncomfortable, that isn't to do with a presence in the room. It's to do with something going on in yourself in the way that you are opening to that presence. So I tend to feel that it's you've got to know yourself how to overcome that fear and that discomfort, because what's present in that room is really fairly neutral. It's very unconditional. I always believe it's totally unconditional. So there is a story. I think it's best to explain that I got from Michael Quirk, a storytelling sculptor in Sligo, and I think he got a very good way of doing this. And he was talking about the Derrickoo. He talked about the otters. The otters, he said, was a forest animal. And then as a forest, all of the elms and the oaks in County Sligo, they were brought down, and it sent the Derrickoo off into the sea. And in the sea, they lived as otters, as a Derrickoo. But what they do now is they enter back, they come ashore and enter into our minds in our dreams. And that can be the reason for our nightmares. But he said, if you actually learn to accept the Derrickoo, they're not there to create your nightmares. It's just your own fear that's creating the nightmares. So if you actually form a relationship with that Derrickoo, and it's instantly forgiven because it's unconditional. The fear is all our own. And I think if you go into stories like the Giancunach, the fairy lover, and then the story of the Ashlings, it's the same thing, is that the intensity of relationship with a sort of a fairy being that you can't get out of your mind. You're so passionate in love and you want to be with that person forever. It gets to a point where you realize that exterior passion is actually something that's happening within you, that lover is actually you wanting to form a relationship with you. So I think the starting point of awareness of what's going on is learning to be unconditional, letting go. You've really got to let your own ego set aside in order to make these experiences. I'm sorry, I can go on and on with this. So I better the next question from you.
No, that's very interesting. Actually, I spent some time up with Michael, and I've got a lovely carving from him as well downstairs. So I'm what I sort of take from that is basically that if you've got enough power within yourself, enough of your own personal force field of self-confidence, that it shouldn't impact you in a way, in a negative way. So
I think you've really got to let go of words like power and shield and things like that, because I kind of think that's, you're obviously trying to be protective. And the thing is, I think people are doing things in reverse. What you're trying to do, again, it's this blame. You feel that these exterior forces are coming and they're clinging to you. The way I interpret it is it's actually ourselves not opening up enough. I mean, the presence is always there. It's up to us to open up, to let go, and to actually accept. It's really a case of acceptance rather than defense. A lot of people talk about defense. Now, when people, if you're trying to follow the sort of ego motivations, and we all, we're human, we're individuals, that's what we got. And it's how to balance it out. It's almost as if it's a lifetime. You're born as an individual, and it's almost like if you treat yourself as being like the seasons of the year, you go from that period of Imog, when you got the new birth, as far as you're concerned, you're the only person on this planet. And then by the time you get to the time of building it, you realize in order to actually exist, you've got to relate to things. And so through our lives, we start unfolding, and we suddenly realize that we've got to share and share. And the one I think, with she and water, I think are two of the same thing. That excuse me, that the water is a whole unity. It flows and it ebbs and it joins up and it breaks up. And I always feel that water itself is the womb. People think of the womb as a physical part of a feminine temple body. But to me, it's the water that's in it that's actually the womb. And so what happens is with humans, obviously, the woman's womb builds up the body to be born. So it's collecting up the water. We live with this water because most of our body, all our lives, is more water than it is physical. And then when it's our passing, that water's got to be released. We've got to let that go, and it rejoins all the other water again. So we got this life experience as our own sort of temple. And I regard that temple, because of it, us being individual, we got this ego thing. I always think the main lesson is we're gradually getting back to that water. We're gradually getting back to that she. And we can only do that by learning the relationships. Funny, I think my father used to say, because fortunately, I wasn't brought up with Christian religion, but his interpretation of heaven and hell, he says, they got it all wrong. He says, he has some feeling that what they're talking about hell is like our life on earth, that suddenly from water we've become into a body, and eventually we're released and become water. But that time we're in the body, that's our hell. But he says it's not such a nasty thing. We're learning how to go from that individual to connection. So I feel that when people talk about power, they're preying on their own ego. When they talk about defending themselves, then there's a kind of fear. If you go for defense, then you're causing divisions. It's us and them. And this is what a lot of people seem to do with spirituality is, there's us and there's these evil spirits, these bad spirits. When it isn't, I always feel it's exactly the same. So instead, I see one thing that you've actually said about working with the she. I look at that in reverse. Is the she is always working with you. It's just you've got to be willing to work with it. There was a lovely couple of memes I've seen lately that sort of points this out with trees. I think it's very good with trees, that trees have been on this planet for thousands, maybe millions of years before the first human, before the first mammals even. And I think we forget that, because if you look at that closely, if they were the first here, we weren't, then the trees depend on us and the food from our being born and dying and so forth in order for trees to survive. And we depend on the trees for us to survive. And I think that's an awareness of connection, is we think we've got control over forestry, over the land, and even conservation. I think you've really got to grow to learn how to get back to letting the life flow work with you rather than working with a she.
No, you're fine. There's lots of, there's lots in what you've just said there, and kind of I'd like to sort of tease some of those items out. It's like you'd mentioned, about sort of that the she are always there working with us, and something that many people will see is they'll be walking along a road, and they'll sort of see flickers at the side of their eye. They kind of feel that presence of the she reclining up against certain trees and so forth. And the thing is that some of the speak is that not to be diverted because they like their own privacy. But at the same time, other people will like to enchant the land to try and make it as pleasant for the Sidhe as possible and as attractive for the Sidhe, like sort of putting out incense and burning candles and leaving out offerings for the Sidhe. What is your feelings about those?
I think when people do offerings and they do candles and so forth, it's, to me, that again, I reverse that interpretation. They may feel in their mind that they're doing it for the Sidhe, but the way I interpret it is they're doing it for themselves in order to feel comfortable in the Sidhe presence. I feel that Sidhe is always there. It's a continual life flow. Before I was here in South Leitrim, we had a restored thatched cottage, and we had labyrinth gardens, and there were 5 labyrinths. We had a tree labyrinth, a herb labyrinth, there was a soft root labyrinth, a triple spiral labyrinth, but the tree one was definitely the leader. And the stuff we're talking about today, it really manifested itself in the tree labyrinth, which was quite wonderful. And I like the use, when you were saying about candles and leaving offerings for the tree. I feel that's a wonderful and very important thing to do in order to, it's a sort of like a conditioning of ourselves, in the same way that before we go out and meet people, we'll have a shower or a bath or something like that. We want to get into that sort of zone, that thing. Now, in the tree labyrinth, there was 3 parts, like there is with the labyrinth journey. And the first part was, okay, the first thing you've got to do, you're not going to have any relationship with trees unless you kind of let go and make a relationship. So I use symbolism for this. And apples, I use various things, but apples were the winner with this. And I had a fire pit, I had a water pit. And so what would happen is the apple, the people would roll the apple in the ash, and that is what they're carrying. That's the burdens, it's the baggage, everything they've got. And so they go on the first part, and it's almost like when they do the first part of the labyrinth going towards the center, it's that they use in the sort of Christian church penance. You could sort of like, I was being very dramatic, but you're walking with a penance, and first thing you've got to do is actually be aware of that baggage. Some people think, oh, this is me. You can't change me. This is the way. And this is, people are looking at ways of defending that. And especially in Scotland, where I lived in here, people like to keep their enemies to the chest. They like to keep the enemies close to them because that's something they understand. But you're not going to make any connection unless you learn how to let go of that. So they do the first part with this apple in the ash, and some people, poor things, they started crying, and they look at the apple and think, yeah, this is me covered in ash. Anyway, through doing that and through letting go, people started connecting, and they would stop at the trees, because I had lots of different species of trees, and they would notice different colors of the leaves. If it was windy, they would notice there'd be a different sound from each rustling of leaves. And so the words, anything related to words, were disappearing. There was suddenly, all their senses were active, and they were synthesizing, and they were starting to make that connection, because it was their senses, their emotions, and the connection was starting to happen. And little bits of vision were starting to come to them. Just like what you say, a presence of going into a room, presence when you go by a holy well, presence in the stone circle, that type of thing. So they get to the center of the labyrinth, and there they would wash the apple, and they would come out of that labyrinth with the clean apple. And what I suggested is they picked up that vision by letting go of themselves and their fears and so forth. I would say walk with that vision, because that's your prophecy of your presence, and go out and walk that journey of that prophecy and that vision. And for some people, it'd be a complete story. For some people, it would unravel a challenge they've got at the moment. For some people, something they didn't even realize was a challenge, and they said, wow, I've got it. I understand this. So it's like some people who've perhaps been a drug addict, and they suddenly feel they've received Christ. So right at the end of this, we then had a session with a talking stick. Because the important thing as well, I feel, everybody's got to share their voice. So nice thing with a talking stick is the person with the stick speaks, everybody else listens. And that was a wonderful therapy of bringing that together. So that to me that was one exercise in breaking yourself down, taking away that fear, taking away that barrier you put around yourself that you think is protecting you, is just letting that all go and realize that the she, in that whatever form you think it is all totally harmless. It's you that's causing yourself harm. That's it for that one.
That's fascinating, John. It brings up two things for me. One of them being sort of the recording, if you saw it, of Professor Ronald Hutton, and the other one being the labyrinth. In the labyrinth in Achill, apparently in West Galway and West Mayo, the fishermen, if there was a storm out at sea, and they would go with the bag, and they would gather the storm in the bag, and then they would take it to the center of the labyrinth, and then so the storm couldn't find its way out of the labyrinth, and the fishermen's boats would get home safely. So but that's a sort of a nice bit of sort of weather magic. The other thing was the recording of Professor Ronald Hutton. He's such an eminent sort of academic scholar into sort of paganism and spirituality. But there was a recording where he had stated that he had heard footsteps as he walked to a bar one night and he perceived it to be the Lenan She, and that his life was in mortal danger. Or he perceived that. I think that the story of the Lenan She was that he would it would take especially young male muses and to their deaths, and
like the Ashling and mermaids, sirens, all very similar. Yes. My feeling on that one is the visions can be incredibly powerful, and I suppose the most powerful I've had is due to kind of accidents, I suppose, sort of out of death experiences. Most powerful one was when I unfortunately had 3 really nasty strokes, and the first time I think I definitely I was away, definitely. And it seemed like as if it was for hours, but it was only probably a matter of seconds. But the one thing, a lot of people, when they say they have out-of-body experiences, they always say they see white. It wasn't with me. It was kind of rainbow colors, but it was definitely water, and it was like, and that was the starting point. And it always seems to be the starting point is this sort of water situation. Now, what I find from that situation, and I do find this even if there isn't an out-of-body experience, like by a pool, by a well, by a running stream, what comes out of that is definitely very, very what looks like beings, people from these visions that are so real, incredibly real. And I can understand how people can say these and can describe and even draw and paint like the banshee and the sprites, anything like that, or even the little girly fairies. I can imagine big. And I think what comes to you out of that vision is something you will personally recognize. And if you can recognize it, it's something you can personally relate to. And it's something, as you say, that's something you can work with. That she have made a presence to you in your mind that you can absolutely relate to. And I know a lot of children, for instance, they have invisible friends. And those invisible friends, they're so real. And they're incredible mentors as well. I know it's very much with myself. The invisible friends is what kept me going, because I had a very violent childhood. So it was down to and parents, I wasn't going to get any guidance much from parents. I got pretty good ones from my uncle and aunts, but it's this invisible friend that took me really from childhood to adulthood. And that's a very lovely way, I think, of being mentored, because you're not being mentored by teachers who have got a format for educating you. You're not being formatted by any books. You are actually gone right into the whole collective consciousness and allowing yourself to be free to perceive that, have those visions, work with those visions. And of course, the thing I love about those visions is if you can draw them down, write them, you can be very theatrical. You can become a storyteller, write things down. You can put plays together, compose songs, and humans love that color. Humans need that color rather than a religion. So yeah, I think it's as far as I should say about that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
no, just yeah. Do you know, you're very close to sort of my next question, which was that can and will the she protect either a place or a person? We've all heard about the tales of fairy abductions of handsome youths such as Tamlin and the land she or mermaid tales, but surely the opposite occurs to protect the humans. Can and will the she protect a place or person? We've heard all of the tales of fairy abductions, of handsome youths such as Tamlin and the Linan She or mermaid tales, but surely the opposite occurs to protect the humans.
now that's funny when you were saying that, because a common thing is the stolen child, that type of thing. Again, I think the fairies get blamed for for a hell of a lot of stuff that's kind of very much human related. I saw a little bit off the topic a bit, but one of the things I find fascinating as far as the Biltner celebrations, it's died out now, but it was around when I was a child, is the celebration of I'm trying to think what the actual word is, and I talked about it a lot of building, where the cattle were sent up into the hills. Not boggy and boggy. I should know the word of that. Bully.
Bullying.
Oh dear, I got my brain
is
something.
Is it bullying? Bully.
Yeah, you got it. That's it. And the idea is because people needed the land below to actually grow crops, because there was no importing like now. So the essential thing: get the cattle out of the way of the crops, get them on the hills, send the daughters up there, and get them to make butter, because butter was a collateral when it was time after Lunasa, when the harvest is done, the debts had to be paid, all the exchanges had to be sorted out. Butter was a lovely collateral, because there was a good export to Europe and beyond with the Irish butter. But of course, it was a whole different life for those women up on the hills, because it was away from mass, it was away from the church and all that stuff. But what would happen is the lads would go up and make sure they got food, make sure they're okay. And then, of course, it's collateral, and the lads would secretly get some of the butter stash. But the lads were never blamed. It was always said to be the fairies stole the butter. And that's what the lads would say. Oh, it must be the fairies. So I always think of those situations that, blame the fairies. If some mishap happens, you can always blame the fairies for it. So even with the changeling, with the changing of the sons, the baby sons for a week, there can be perhaps a situation of a virus or something going around, but you can blame the fairies on that as well. Again, if we do that in modern times, I put the blame on the fairies. It's going back to what I was talking about in the beginning, is all that stuff is sort of in our own minds, and it's no good sort of blaming the fairies, because in your own mind, if you blame the fairies, you start thinking of the mischief, and to me it's a kind of suicide. If you more and more disconnect with acceptance of the help of the fairies, you really sort of, I'm trying to think of a proverb around that. You're really biting the hand that feeds you, kind of thing. So I think it's probably a modern concept, because if you started teaching this idea of personal responsibility, you've got your own personal temple, the she is there for you always. It's up to you to open up to it. Churches would definitely banish that. And perhaps before the churches, what they call the druids, the chieftains and so forth, everything was about human control. And you don't get human control until you somehow educate and brainwash the humans into following your commands. And I think humans have always done that, especially human men have always done that together. I think we can see that in the way things grow. One of the interests in recent years has been publicizing how all living things connect. So you go into a forest, everything is connecting and relating to each other, and there's a network, there's a wild wood web, so forth. Look into what they're talking about. Everything they're talking about is what's happening underground. And that's true for the underground survival, the roots, the fungi, everything that's underground, the insects, whichever way they're doing it, that's a whole network. It's dark, it's connecting, it's all very, very feminine, it's all very yin. And but soon as everything comes out of the soil, when the new birth is done and they get to the surface, all changes. They glare with the light, the sun's coming down, especially with trees, are all fighting for the light. And there's certainly not much compassion between plants above ground. It's a very competitive thing. And they even manipulate other plants. Trees manipulate other trees. Whereas underground, you've got that womb, you've got that protection. And no wonder they talk about Tuatha Dé Danann relating to being in the earth, because in the earth, they try to keep it all together. So I always look, we've got this, the sun and so forth, the whole heat, the yang going on the cold earth. And it needs the two in order to create a sort of balance for life to exist on the surface. So I think there's a lot to do. I think a lot of people cling to that everything on the surface is a fight, it's a competition. And one of the things, I did go to Sunday school. One of the things, my mother passed away when I was 4. So the weirdest thing my father ever did is he quickly married a woman who was a very devout Methodist. And she was quite incredible. She insisted I'd be top of the class before I even got to school, got me to read and write very fluidly. But it wasn't a children's book. She slammed down the King James Bible in front of me, and I learned to read with that. And the first thing I picked up somehow, I really loved the kind of resurrection story. And that's had a huge impact on my entire life. So one of the things I tend to say, and what I seem to recognize in a lot of situations, people seem to get stuck at the crucifixion. That they're, there's the whole blame, they're doing the protection, all sorts of intense things going on. And I always keep thinking, please, please move on to the resurrection. Very few people seem to move themselves onto that resurrection. And I think we do that if we try to live in concepts of beginnings and ends. I don't believe in beginnings and ends whatsoever. I believe in cycles. So between what seems people interpret as an end and a beginning, you've got this lovely transition of resurrection, of where the debris becomes new life again. And that's another thing. I think you become very protective when you put blinkers on, and you're just wanting to go forward. But if you take those blinkers off and vision things as circles, cycles, spirals, then your whole vision changes. And when your vision changes like that, I think you connect better. that's how you become inclusive, just like what goes on with the roots underground.
That's very interesting, John. It kind of reminds me of the work that an author, John Allegro, discussed with regards to mycelium and sort of the mushroom cult. He referred to sort of mushrooms as being sort of Jesus, which is sort of the Jesus character. Um, but we were talking sort of about sort of the what's happening underground, and it brings me back to, you know, the hollow places. I mean, sort of the west of Ireland is phenomenal for its hollow places, especially up there in Cash Corrigan, you know, sort of with the Tuatha De Dan, you know, sort of the Tripping She. And what are your feelings with regards to what are your feelings with regards to the Tuatha De Dan, and also speak to people who have had their fairy sort of they've met with their Tamlin characters, they've met with the mermaids, you know, sort of they've had you know, they've come across the Lenan Shi and sort of all of the Banshee, they've heard the Banshee, and they've met them sort of in daily life, you know, and then they realize that, you know, that wasn't a person, that was the she, you know, sort of the so I mean, what about those sort of instances? Have you learned anything about those kind of situations, John?
Well, those stories, in whichever form they come, it's really sort of repeating what I've said so far. That uh, the one thing that comes with individual, if you try to remain the individual, you're defending your ego. It brings on a kind of lust because you become kind of individual. Then I think you approach things with a kind of lust. So if you see, if a lad, you know, we're really going back to the heat of the sun, the male thing, and underground, the cold. But being a lad and you see a beautiful mermaid or an Inchi or even Ashling and all those, you think, oh yeah, yeah, the kind of passions come up, and the last thing you're thinking of is forming a relationship with this being. Your whole emotion is about lust. What am I personally going to get from this? You know, what am I personally going to feel? I just want a stronger feeling. I want, you know, this is such a beautiful person or a being. I just want that person to be closer. And so they have that lust, and then suddenly realizing that lust ends up being an empty vessel. And boy, that really, I should think that really is an introduction to many of mental health problems, especially amongst men. With that, yeah, something else you were asking. You were talking about Kish Corrigan Caves.
Absolutely,
Uh,
yes.
yeah, because I lived near Kishkoron caves because I lived by there for several years. So I did tours and storytelling up there. And what I love about that is the mythological loch that's in the middle. And there are various versions of the stories of the Dagda mating. A lot of people say the Morrigan or the Morrigu. I like the more in the Corricuan myself, but that's not said. But entering into the mountain, and actually that water in the hidden loch getting warmer and warmer as you come up to the winter solstice, and suddenly you've got this grand conception, and I think a lot of that comes in from the Norse folklore of Freyr as
Odin. Odin.
yes, yes, yes. So their sort of mating story is very similar to this actor and Morrigan, I find out. But it's a lovely association, I think, because you've got this transition from Soan to Imok. And there is that transition where suddenly the cold gets a spark in it, a spark of fertility. And then when the Imbolc starts, then the water starts flowing. The one thing at Imbolc that's quite common, and not only over that hill, the hill of Caish, also going into Cavan. We got all these swallow holes because if we're going to get snow, it's going to be around that time. If we're going to get a lot of rain, it's going to be that time. You've got all this water coming down in the swallow holes, and that is what's going to fill up the holy wells. And the holy wells seem to be at their most abundant at the Imbolc, and the water in the that's actually traveling through the soil is going to be at its most abundant. And this all comes from very much this transition of working with the debris, nature working with the debris and going through to that and through to the wells. And so no wonder we're talking about the fertility. And I think you mentioned of like the tree hugging, because the one thing that when we pass Imbolc going on to Bildner, the one thing, you put your ear up against the trees, especially end of February, especially in March, and you hear the sap going up, and the visions you can get as you put your ear to it, it sends you just to another place. And I think to actually connect with those season changes is such a wonderful thing. And I think it's by doing so you actually understand how the shears work and that transition between the seasons. And that's why I cover with nature folklore. But what happens is when people tell the stories, instead of relating direct to what's actually happening with the weather, what's happening with the water flowing, and all the things that's happening underground, a lot of people stick overground and they want to deal with heroes. They get into battles, they get into heads being chopped off. And the problem I find with heroes is that people want to follow heroes, and they want to follow heroes instead of following themselves. And so people lose their voice to heroes. And I think that's a problem. And I think even we're seeing that in USA politics right now. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this in the interview. It might be to a dark area, but I find it's quite interesting that on the sort of Republican and on the right, what they call the right politics, is all about appointing a hero. And in some ways, I somehow think that the right of the USA, the Republicans, they want it to be a dictatorship like China and Russia, because what you've got is one king, you've got one head person, and that's the superhero. And suddenly people don't have to worry about the thing because the king will provide for all, rather than when you're in an underground situation where it's up to everybody cooperating with everything else. And I see those two differences.
I think John, and the critical thing for me in this is, to be honest, the magical landscape of Leitrim and that whole area, sort of the west of Ireland, going up to sort of Fermanagh, sort of even the Marble Arch Caves. The fact that we can sort of travel around in boats. It's actually quite a magical, ethereal
I
experience.
love that boat into the Marble Arches. Yeah, that's a wonderful experience for anyone.
But that whole landscape, I think was it Thomas Sheridan had done some research about Leitrim and about some inauguration stone that was taken for inauguration for the in his Walpurgis Night book. It's an incredible study. It really is. It's an incredible sort of what's around us, so, and what we don't see. But it brings me on to the next question, which is, we have there's some sites that are known to be sort of maybe darker kind of places, and then, but what are the places for the magical places for the beneficial she?
It's anywhere where you can feel comfortable. I think the first thing you got to do, you're not going to recognize the she. The she is not going to be. Well, it is its benefit to everybody at all times. If there was no she, we wouldn't be alive. We'd be dead. We'd be back into the water again. But I think the important thing, it's all about trust. It's impossible to have a relationship, an association with anything that we call the fae, the she, the fairies, without actually being in a total situation of trust. And trust is not easy for most people, I suppose. So you've got to find a situation where you actually feel trust. And going back to that story I was saying with Michael Quirk, is that with the nightmare and the intrusion, Derek, into the nightmare, once you trust that, then you've got no fear of it. So you've got to be in a situation of trust. A lot of people say go up to Carrickeel. I've taken various groups up, many groups up to Carrickeel, and some people, you go up to the top cairn. Should know when that. So it's like G's the bottom, then it's the K, isn't it? That you go into the top one, and it's a very narrow entrance, and you go into it. A lot of people get very scared going into that one. So that's not a trusting place for themselves. They say they want to be close to the ancestors, but so that's no good. You've got to find, some people, they can go into the Cache Caves, they can go into the cairns, and they can feel completely at home and feel they're absolutely, totally connected to the ancestors. And it depends what they're actually saying about. To me, the ancestors, that's vital, because that's our connection to our collective consciousness. Because when you're in a comfortable site, whether it's in a cave, whether it's a stone cairn, whether it's beside a certain tree, whether it's in a bog, or it's just a favorite place by the water. People get these feelings by certain holy wells. When you've got that comfort, and it's like a medicine, it's like a therapy that just goes head to toe. You suddenly feel that, whoa, it's a very tantric thing, I think, that, your trust is just, everything's broken down. You just got this complete trust. And when you've got this extreme trust because you found somewhere comfortable, you not only feel what people call the whole energy, it's a whole recharging. Everybody needs a recharging spot. Everybody needs not to be alone and actually get back into exchanging with people. But you can't live an entire life of exchanging people, because you'll be worn out. The life in you is being given away all the time to other people and other situations, because we all moan about this, that we're giving so much of our life and our energy away, and people are not giving it back. Some people just find it impossible. So we need these recharge spots, and it's through these recharge spots, places we trust, they energize. That's where I feel we get these visions. And if we're kind of flustered, we're frustrated, we're stressed, we got a problem we can't solve, if we're in that place we trust, not only do the visions calm us and recharge us, but suddenly it's like, I think, children at school that are having a struggle with a maths problem. And then all of a sudden a vision comes to them of how to work that problem, and they'll shriek out, "I've got it." And I think that's what happens in these trusting situations, that it reveals to you what you need to know. And I think that's very precious, because if you go away and journal it and write it down or do some doodles, you're going to interpret that as images. So there's no set template for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. The from what you're saying there, I'm kind of getting that you're feeling that that she themselves are kind of like a life force energy, a magical life force energy, and I wouldn't say, but there is also sort of the and there's the tripping she, and sort of there's the midnight court, and there's all of the other legends and so forth, attributed to the various sort of landscapes, like again back up in sort of Sligo, Leitrim, so and Clare, so the so
I think it's
so
simple. I think it's
the
much more
genus
simple than
loci.
life force. I think it's more simple than life force energy. I simply think it's water, because there's so many legends that have, and I love the stories. There's several creation stories around the world of how the earth was entirely water. There was no land, and so the stories sort of go on about how sea creatures put together mud and push the mud above the sea, and the sun made it hard, and that's how land was created. But I think that's very symbolic. It all starts with the water. There was nothing physical before water, and it's true with us now. That like I was saying, that like trees have been around for millions of years before humans, but humans seem to think they're in control of the landscape and the trees. And so humans, being physical, think they're in charge of the water. But again, I think it all starts with the water, and everything that people, it's very boring just to talk about water, but everything to me that she, fairies, it all starts with the water. If you don't have the water, you don't have any of it. That's what I believe in on that.
That's very interesting. It's a step beyond sort of the genus loci. Also, there's certain modes of thought with regards to that the she get horribly badly offended by certain items. So they get hurt. Apparently they're very offended by the likes of iron or urine. Is there What other objects are they offended by, and how can that be appeased? Like say, if with the horseshoe at the top of the door or something like that. How can these things? How can these
Again,
things
I think
be
that's
appeased?
I think that's old human invention, because the one thing is, it's exclusively human. You won't find any other mammals banging in coins and nails. You won't find any. There's a lot of things us humans do, and we forget that no other animals do it. And the thing is, the she's not just exclusive to humans; it's there for all life. And the idea, oh God, there's something fascinating that does, from the conversation I had with the singer harpist, the Kurdish one, because that was quite a thing with them to bang metal into the trees, because the metal was actually symbolic of their pain, of their frustration. And by putting that in, they were actually exchanging their pain, their depression, their injury into the tree and saying, look, tree, sort it out. And I think that's, sounds, and it's funny enough, they call them wishing trees, sort out this healing. But the thing is, that's not thought of is what what the metal does to the tree. But then there's another mythology there. It's always believed that if we put a lot of metal into a tree, that it'll kill it. Strangely, that's not the case, because there's a lot of trees, if you go around, when they mature, especially in parks, you'll get metal seats by a tree because it's a lovely place to watch the view or watch the pond, watch the swans, whatever it is. Then over time, that seat will actually, as the tree expands the trunk, it'll actually eat the seat. And that metal seat does the tree absolutely no harm. But I think it's to do
It seems
of
to
the
be. It
act
seems
of.
to be copper. Yeah. It seems to be copper that's poisonous to trees. So,
That's a myth. That is actually a myth,
it's
surprisingly. But I think it shouldn't be done because it is an abuse. You're not actually poisoning the tree, but I think it's the human approach to putting coins in, putting nails in, putting pins in, and even throwing all this stuff in the water is to me an egocentric human action. And I think the problem is in the action, not in the actual result, because the water in the tree can consume all this without actual harm, but the harm to me is in the deed, because you're abusing that relationship. Like I was saying, from what I was explaining there, the whole Kurdish thing of putting the nails in is, hey tree, sort out my problems. Here's a nail because this is how I feel. And I think there's a lot of it in that. Of course, over in the UK and Ireland, Scotland especially, they're actually feeling they're doing a good deed by putting the metal in it. So it's the deed itself and the personal lust
thing.
we have. It's not modern. It's going back for people have been doing this for thousands of years. Because there's even stories, especially of some tribes, the Jutes, the Anglo-Saxons, and probably the Slavs, in a way that when it was all sort of patriarchal. So if there were no sons born and the line of a family didn't have any sons to take over inheritance, so all of the weaponry of the last male would be thrown into the water. And so then the women became the possession of the next up, the chieftain, and so forth. And so there's that sort of background history. And of course, that gets reversed when Excalibur is told about in the King Arthur. It's, hey, there's this sword from one of the ancestors, you could do with it. So it's like bringing that back alive again. So you've got a mixture of that mythology and folklore thrown in it. But the idea of metal, I mean, metal is man-made. And it's very much an abuse on the landscape anyway to make the metal, because when you pull rocks, it's not like when you cut trees or coppice trees or you grow vegetables, the next year it's all going to come back again. Whereas with rocks, it's not going to come back again. You're really raping the soil, raping the earth with something that can't go back again. And if it does, it'll take millions of years. So I think that has to be considered, is when we mess about with rock, is, you know, you're realizing you're taking something that's not going to be replaced. And I think that's certainly the case with metal, even though I think traditionally in a lot of tribes, it was the women that learned how to extract metals originally, because they were the fire keepers originally. And then I think the men took over.
Of course, there's Bridget, and she was associated with blacksmithing. So tell me this now, John, there's the liminal place where the she inhabit. What is that like? Is that an ethereal, beautiful Tir na Nog, or or is it, as some say, desolate and unkept, sort of barren land with sick animals?
I think again, it's all to do with the human perception. These stories are told that way, and the Christian Church and all of the main religions, Muslim, Buddhist, they're all talking about kind of an afterlife or a reincarnation life. And it's always explained, especially in the Christian, it's another thought really, but the idea that, okay, if things seem to be messed up in this life, which you shouldn't even think of that, you've got this beautiful land, beautiful shore that you're going to go to. And it's tragic, but also in a way I find fairly hilarious. Like, you hear this with the terrorists, the sort of splinter groups of the Arabs that are terrorists, are saying, oh, if you do this deed and you're a suicide bomber, then you've got heaven with 19 virgins to look forward to. And the feeling, I thought, the worst thing in the world would be for me to be in a room with 19 virgins. What kind of heaven would that be? You know, so it's funny, the concept that, I think it's the human concept. The idea is that you've got something to look forward to. But of course, that can be damaging, because you're suddenly living a life of earthly penance because some priest and teacher, shaman even, has told you that, don't worry about the hardships now. You're just going to go on to this beautiful land. So that, I think, can be damaging. I think you've got to think of your life on earth. You've got the she, you've got this life coming through you. This so-called Tir na Nog, it's with you. It's around you. You're in Tir na Nog the whole time, but you're allowing people to control you, to eliminate that from your life by promising you, we'll come to that, which is, I think, incredibly demeaning. And I think that's one of the things, people lose their voice of it. They become under the commandment. We get this just in the school system. You know, as a child, you're full of wonder, you're exploring, you're looking at things, you have the imaginary friends, you're right there with the she, you're following with the she ways. But as soon as you get to school, there's a process of timetables, things you have to learn, formats you have to learn. And so you're not learning anymore. You're just being educated to be fitting into the template. And I think that, that's not just a modern thing. I believe that every chieftain situation, territorial situation has enforced this. This is what makes a leader, is because we suddenly surrender ourselves. So it's suddenly as much nicer to let the leader sort it out for us. I know some Russian people, before there was problems in Russia, they actually missed being in Russia, because when they were in Russia, here they have to warm up their homes. They're responsible for paying the bills. They have to pay for fuel to if they want hot water and so forth. Whereas in Russia, the state paid for a hot water system that went through every house. You didn't have to worry about it. So again, they were sort of missing those luxuries. And the same in Libya, when Gaddafi was leader there, he provided everybody with everything. There was no need, there was no want. So I think we've got to get rid of that. And of course, we're facing this now with this artificial intelligence that's going to suck people in and say, just put it into the AI servers. That will come out with the answers. We can pass exams with essays and stuff that come out of that. And but you're taking that she away from you. You're ignoring that every time you make that kind of step. Even Google. I mean, before there was internet and there was Google, we went to libraries. We went to storytellers. But now, and you get this on the social media. If someone asks a question, Google's your friend, people just dismiss, and it's the easy way out kind of thing. And it's been talked about in church. Churches say, if you follow the devil, you're only doing so because it seems easier.
Well, do you know what I'm gathering from what you're saying there, John, is to be honest, it's that the magic and the mythology from the hollow places is actually the most tangible aspect of what we're looking at. I mean, whenever you talk about the Cash Corrigan, about sort of the landscape up sort of Leitrim, Sligo, was it Mayo, Galway, is that there's a more tangible sort of connection, sort of where the field is thin, sort of like down sort of our Marble Arch caves, and sort of in those hollow places and beneath the earth where we can move around in boats, like as if we're ethereal characters. It's
if you feel comfortable with that, the magic happens. If you feel comfortable and you're trusting, suddenly because you've allowed yourself to be trusting, all this magic happens. When you got fear, there's going to be no magic. You're putting a barrier up against stuff, so no magic's going to happen. You're in a bubble, and the magic is so limited within a bubble.
It brings us right the way back to the path workings from the fairy way by Hume, because that's a way for us to connect with that and to open up all of those other aspects of the magic around us in our sort of in our everyday life, so which is it's lovely that we've sort of come around sort of full circle from this sort of inquiry in the she and the fairy in Ireland in this day and age, so is there anything else you'd like to add there, John?
Yeah, the one thing is the power of story. A lot of the things you've been talking about, they come up in stories, and I talk about how it all starts with water. And if we think in that's so damn boring. We use languages. We use a huge vocabulary that over the many centuries since the medieval scribes in this area, we've learned to put together sentences, and with that we can tell stories. And but the one thing I find is important is, with the Orm come with that, is the idea. Before there was these worded and linear languages, we had prompts. And I think even the cave drawings, they're prompts. But with the prompts, even the prompts tell us a story. The Gaelic place names, they tell us a story. I think these are sort of important, because when I was a child and I took a fascination from the Ordnance Survey maps, I'd see these. I was only 6 at the time, but I was fascinated seeing listed the tumuli and the stone circles, the holy wells. And I would go to them, farmers would accompany me and tell me the stories, but they'd always say, how would you want to know about a bunch of old stones for? It's just rubbish. But they still tell the story, and I tell them something back. I said, well, I heard that the fairies are here building her and Mayday. And he said, that's funny you say that. My mother used to say blah, blah, blah. My grandmother used to say, my father used to say. So suddenly I get all these stories, and then he finish it off. But I still don't understand why he was see a bunch of old stones for. So what I would do from that point, I'd pick up these stories. I'd be totally confused as a little boy. So I used to get my friends together. I said, look, I went to this farm. Look at this on the map. I went to that circle there. I went to that well there. And I heard about this and heard about that. And I said, look, I don't understand any of this. Let's see if we take on different personalities. So in the stories, there was characters. And of course, like what you've been saying, there were characters that seemed to be good, characters that seemed to be bad. And then there was always some kind of medicine. And of course, this comes out in Mama's plays. And so I'd get these friends to act out these characters and interact with each other. And I say, look, improvise. So of course they were shy of it at first. But I said, let's play a game. Let's improvise. You are that character. You are the fairy. You are the medicine person. And you are the conqueror, blah, blah, blah. Let's interact and see what we can put together with that. And it was amazing. People did interact. And I found through doing that, we all learned something about how each of these elements of people related to each other. And you realize at the end of that, you'd put a story together. You'd put together, if we could write it down at the time, we'd probably made a real fine television drama or a really nice theatre production. And of course, the first job I had was doing this sort of stuff with a theatre company. So I did evolve through that. So the thing with those stories, I think is very important, is always don't ever lose touch with the core of that story. Don't lose touch with that vision, with that inspiration. Don't believe in the story itself. Let the story be the colorful way of expressing something with our language, with our art, with our painting, with our sculpture, that might seem simple and boring unless we put form to it. And people wouldn't understand any of it anyway. So that, I think the important thing is believe in the source of the story rather than the story itself. A very good example of that, when I worked in the USA, I was in research and development for a herb company run by a Chinese man, and we were doing a conference in California, and he used orange as an example because California it's oranges. I would have used an apple. And someone said, well, do you make supplements? And he said, well, trouble with supplements. He said, the best way of explaining this is, and he grabbed an orange. He said, look at this orange. He said, where we do our research and development, we can take this orange, we can separate the proteins, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, coenzymes, etc. And we can separate all these things and make use of them if we want. The trouble is we couldn't put the orange back together again. And it's what holds the orange together that is the nutrition, not the components. And that holds it together is what carries these elements through your body and until it picks up on another energy. And that's our nutrition. The trouble with supplements, he said, is they've got to find some life in your body to make them work. Whereas if you ate the whole orange, it's all in one. And I've used that in so many situations. So don't lose that core, otherwise the spirit. And also, people talk about ascendants. Don't forget about your descendants, because there's so much focus when people go to ancient sites and they want to contact their ancestors, believing that the contact with ancestors is going to sort of solve some of their mysteries. The point is, they are going to be someone's ancestor one day. Everybody's going to be someone's, most people are going to be ancestors of someone. So think of the descendants, because how you evolve and how you actually associate, how you actually trust, how you actually connect with the she, the Fey world, and so forth, that is what's going to be passed on. If you are defending yourself against the Sidhe, if you're trying to build up against so-called evil spirits, I mean, this is all been passed down by religions and chieftains. You got to lose that for the benefit of your descendants. And that's what my whole belief in this is people talk about climate change, environmental problems and so forth, and then of course they vote for people and hope those people voted would sort it out. It's got to be a collective consciousness between people. I always say you can't preserve a woodland or a forest until you've got actual passion for the trees and the forest. If you don't have that passion, no matter what spreadsheets and plans you do, and no matter what stories you follow, it's not going to work. You've got to have that connection, and you're not going to have that connection following a linear pattern. You've got to have that trust in the cycles that things work, the wavelengths, and the spiraling. It's got to all be collective, and don't lose touch with the core of it all. And the other thing is, don't forget that time and space are man-made coordinations. Some human probably put 3 sticks together, realized that the gaps between the sticks were equal, and think, I can make use of this. And of course, that was the start of geometry. And through that, you could invent time and space. And because humans are naturally builders, this has been very convenient for building things. So I think you've got to, in order to contact the Sidhe, you've even got to get rid of your concepts of time and space as well. Otherwise, you don't make that connection.
That's it's very interesting, John. I'm sort of it conjures up so many questions, you know. So it really does. It really does. I'm kind of sort of thinking about sort of how the role of the bard and the Shanachie, how they basically what they do is they draw up the energy and the mythology of the land, and how that is moved out, and how that is affected and into the naming, the nomenclature on the landscape of the townlands and of the different features within the landscape. I mean, we were talking about sort of even, time and space, and the great sort of the fella behind the design of sort of our modern calendar was it Lazarian from County Carlow, so, but I mean, there's so much here within our little Ireland, that sort of what we went out and took to educate sort of, and to bring our own flavor to the rest of the world, which sort of, which all came back in its own time, so but it just raises so many questions about sort of the spirit of this land,
Yeah, questions. That's a thing. As a strong belief with me is, I think it's futile to even. Questions. I think you've got to live with questions. I think it's futile to try and find answers, because every time you think you've got an answer, all you've done is open the door to another few thousand questions. But if we train ourselves to live with questions, then we will always have constant wonder. And when we have constant wonder, we have constant connection. And we also it weakens the walls we put around us. If we are full of wonder, then we're not going to put walls around us. We're just going to adventure. We're going to connect. We're going to sense. And so we live with questions. If we live with questions, live with our wonder, the answers look after themselves. We don't even have to think about answers, because we're always going to have these visions of the next step.
Look, John, thank you very much for talking to me today, and certainly we'll be continuing to follow your live broadcasts and YouTube channel. So,
right.
Which I thoroughly enjoy. So, now, what do you have any new exciting projects on the horizon?
Oh goodness, it's just continuing what I'm doing, isn't it? Of the nature folklore did start off as meetings, the restored thatch cottage, and using the tree labyrinth mainly, really duplicating what we were doing with the bards in the woods, the nature walks, and going to our favorite heritage tree. And around the tree, we did exactly the same as we did with the labyrinth. So with the COVID, that all went online, and suddenly I realized, boy, this is international. And unfortunately, I just before COVID, I had 2 nasty strokes and then a nasty COVID. So I couldn't do what I was doing before, not physically. So that's why I ended up staying online. But then I was realizing all this stuff I was putting out with my nature folklore program. I thought this is actually, I'm wasting myself putting this into videos. So I'm now trying to concentrate. I want to get a series of 4 books out, 1 for each season. It's going to be the nature folklore series. So there'll be an Amalgam, Beldner, Lunacer, and so on. 1 for each, as a sense of going through the transitions there. So I nearly gave up the broadcasting. I thought, no, there's some very interesting things going on, and I follow through the social media, through the newspapers, and I always save a list of things I want to talk about, even in conversations I have with people. So that's why it's Nature Echoes. I try and take 1 to 3 issues, which is to do with connecting with nature. It's a combination of stuff that's going on, physical stuff that's going on, and then I apply folklore to it as a way of understanding what's going on with that news item rather than apply the science. So I'll be continuing doing that. So that if there is a project going on, it's finally manifesting these set of 4 books, because the last time I brought the book out, it was part of a series, Bathing in the Fae's Breath, Bolanashiga, and I had to whittle it down from 600 pages to 300 pages, and I put it out there. I think it was €15, and people complained. They said, far too expensive. And so someone said, they said, oh, you should be selling it for €10. That's what people are selling books for these days. Well, this was a few years ago. And someone who overheard this, he said, John, you went through this. You did this all wrong. He said, what you should have done, instead of selling 1 book of 300 pages for €15, you should have split it up into 3 books of 100 pages each, sold them for €10 each. People would have thought they had fantastic value. So and that's is part of the lesson for that. What else is going? A lot of people that used to come on retreats and on sort of guided storytelling tours with me and hikes, which I can't do now, they're insisting when they come to Ireland from Australia, from the USA, Canada, they still want to spend some time with me. So as from next Tuesday, it's like bang, 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 a whole succession of people. I don't know how it's going to work out, but they just want they want my company to go over some stuff before they go around Ireland. So there's quite a bit of that. What I would love to do is the stuff I do with the nature folklore that's online. I think I'm too much online. I'm going to have to start getting into person, people retreats. I just love having people around. And so if there's a future project with books, yes, the books work as a calling card. And but then get back into being around people. That's what I'd love to do. I won't be going around touring with them so much, but if they're coming to Ireland or living in Ireland, then a couple of days in retreat could be part of their passage. And this is very much the trend. There used to be a thing years ago. People would come from overseas, they'd come to Ireland and expect to do the whole of Ireland in 5 or 6 days, which is really ridiculous, because you're racing about, driving around, just taking photographs. You're not doing anything. You're not experiencing anything. If they went anywhere else, they'd just choose a town and they would stay there. But I think more people are actually coming to Ireland for experiences. They want to come here. They might want to spend time in a traditional music school. They're quite happy to go to some little place like Drumshanbo and stay there for 2 weeks, learn how to play a mandolin or something. They don't have to rush around. So there's a lot of people now very much into experiential breaks rather than just trying to take postcard pictures everywhere, which I think is delightful. I think that's a lovely trend. So I'd like to get back into that and hopefully be part of that. So I think that's about, and of course I don't know how many more years I've got to live anyway. So I just take everything to the full.
Well, no, thank you very much, John. I really appreciate that.
Thank you Josie. Thanks you
Thank
for
you. Bye
that.
for
And
now.
I trust your gathering. I'm sorry I can't be at your gathering there in Galway, County Galway. I trust
That's
that will all go fantastic.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope so too. Certainly, I'm looking forward to. We have Astrid is going to be sort of doing some
Ah,
chording with
lovely.
Nettle.
Oh,
Yeah,
I wish.
so
Yeah, I'd
she
love
might
to.
bring her
Love.
harp too. She
Oh,
might bring
I'm
her harp
sure she
too.
will. She'll
So
bring the fiddle at least,
oh wow,
because that's portable.
and also we have Thomas Sheridan is going to be
Yes.
giving a talk. We've got the Irish Society of Dicers are going to
Yeah.
be sort of basically sort of just doing some dicing and maybe sort of showing some of the rest of us how they're going at it, and also a walk and tour around the ferry field with Pat Noonan. So
Very
that's going to
good.
be a lot of fun.
Yes. Yeah. That's a fun thing indeed.
So these are little
Yeah.
recordings that we're doing to basically just to supplement sort of the event, and I'll be putting these out in before the event just for people that are sort of coming along, just to get them into the vibe for what we're going to be talking about, and just to get them sort of acquainted with the subject matter. So
I think the whole package you're putting together is absolutely marvelous, and
that's
it's
lovely.
wonderful
Thank
that you're
you.
dedicating yourself to coordinating this together. Some wonderful people coming together there, and thank you for inviting me to be part of that.
Thank
That's
you, John.
terrific.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And it has for me.